Hey, what is up everybody? Platform Disciple here, and it's been a very long time since I have made a video. I apologize for that, but I've just been super busy. I have a new job that I am training for, so I just haven't had the time to record or even play very much recently, but hopefully that will change once I actually start working, because I will be back on a regular and predictable schedule. But let's get into the video today, which is that the Rebellion set, the newest set in Infinity Wars, has been out for a very long time now, enough that we have a pretty full understanding of which cards were hits and which cards were misses and how much they impacted the game. So today we were looking at the 10 most impactful cards from Rebellion. And to clarify, when I say impactful, I mean that they really changed the way the game is played in some kind of way. And just to give an example of a card that is powerful but not impactful, Cowardly Recruit, even though this card is pretty much an auto include in any flamed on aggressive deck, because it's just so strong and has virtually no drawback. It didn't really change how the game is played. It didn't change Flamed On. It didn't change how you play against Flamed On. So it's not on this list. That being said, let's do our honorable mentions, beginning with Raziel, who is just such a strong commander for the Overseers faction. He really makes turn 1 removal super important against double Overseers and better. And most significantly, he is an uncommon, which changes the ability for newer players to jump into a very competitive deck and have a powerful commander. Like, to make a comparison, Kalor is a legendary and is a 1-drop and it's an auto include in basically any command zone for 2 Flamed On or higher. And if Kalor were an uncommon the way Raziel is, I can promise you would see more Flamed On in ranked, at least, than you do now, just because it's so strong. And I'm bringing up Raziel for that reason. Next, we've got Death Blast, honorable mention. Reason that it is not on the list, despite the fact it has been featured in one of the best decks in the game for a long time, is that there's just already a lot of cards that do the same kind of thing. Most notably, we've got Dark Blast, which, although Death Blast is situationally substantially better, the deck that Death Blast is currently in would still exist even without Death Blast. It would just be slightly worse. And we know this because I was playing a free-to-play version in ranked the last month and did fairly well with it. Okay, then we've got Counterspell, which I'm bringing up just because not only is it a very strong card, but it does something that didn't exist in the game prior to that, and it's now a card that you really have to care about playing around. One thing I will also point out is that it is one of the few cards in the game that can actually stop the Calamity from happening, and that alone makes it mention worthy, even though it didn't make the top 10. Next, we've got Taiga. Insanely strong, but didn't make this list because I don't feel that it really changed the way the robots deck gets played very much. That even though you see this a lot and it's a very strong card and you really have to care about it a lot when it comes out, buffing your characters, buffing the artificial characters was not something that was not, I mean, it's pretty normal for Genesis, so that's why it didn't make the list. And the last honorable mention is Malignant, who is just insanely good, and wow, it's just such a good card that I would feel bad if I didn't mention it at least. But it didn't make the list because that even though it's just disgustingly powerful in the decks that use it, the decks that use it would still exist. They just wouldn't have this insanely good recurring resource. That's why I didn't make the list. Now we will go to the top 10, beginning with number 10, Diseased Brute, one that you were probably not expecting me to say. And the reason for that is Diseased Brute sees very little constructed play. But the reason it is in the top 10 is because of Rift Run. And there are a few cards on this list, not many, but there are a few cards on the list that are on the list because of Rift Run. And why is it so crazy in Rift Run? First, it's 1 purity, and second, it is a common. Those two combinations mean that you will see a lot of this card when you are drafting decks and when you are playing against decks. And it's just so freaking good that you're gonna see it all the time, and it's pretty much an auto pick anytime you see the card. Like, I would gladly play a Rift Run deck that had 5 of these in it, and I wouldn't care. It's that good. And not only that, but Varor was not a top dog in Rift Run prior to Rebellion, and it got so much stronger with the introduction of this card to the card pool. Next, we have a similar Rift Run card that we have to mention, Host to the Ancestors. Same deal. It's a 1 purity common, so you see a lot of it. It's strong enough that it's pretty much an auto pick, and it's in Descendants of the Dragons, which was, once again, like Varor, not the strongest Rift Run faction. But I will also say that this card is strong enough that I've seen it in Constructed, and it's pretty good. Like, I have seen it in fairly competitive decks. It's not my favorite card in Constructed, but it's that good. And in Rift Run, it's even crazier because your opponent is very likely not to have a way to handle this other than throwing an entire board of creatures into it if it's in the defense zone. Because the best way to deal with it is to exhaust it or transform it in some way, but not every deck in Rift Run is just, not every deck has those resources. So you have to deal with it the hard way a lot of times, which very frequently means over trading your characters into it. So completely changes Rift Run. I think it's oh man, it's so good in Rift Run. It's disgusting. All right, number 8, Biganator. And this card has already seen a few changes because of how impactful it was. And even post changes, these little nerfs that it got, I think it's still really impactful. And the reason for that is that it took the Logarithmatron deck, which was already all right. It wasn't my favorite deck. I don't think it was the best deck, but now it is a real serious contender. And for those of you who don't know, the Logarithmatron decks focus on doubling Logarithmatron's power until it has enough to one-shot your opponent, and then you can play Hakim to give it Unstoppable, which basically guarantees that it's going to get through for 100% of your opponent's health through any defense. So yeah, and Biganator is a very strong card to have in the command zone because you can drop it turn 1 and it immediately becomes a 3/3 because you're going to overcharge your Logarithmatron turn 1. And it's not a bad card in the deck either because you can, if you get it early, you can play it and it's going to get big. And if you get it late, you just overcharge it to Logarithmatron. That's the reason this card is on that list. It just made that deck so much stronger that you see it a lot more. Okay, next, Declarius. Oh boy. And this card, first of all, Overseers was just not that strong prior to Rebellion, and they got a lot of good cards, and the best one by far, in my opinion, is Declarius. So for putting Overseers back on the board alone, he's in there. But in addition to that, his effect is just so powerful against aggro and tempo that it really changes how you play the game. And it's just got such a strong impact when it's in your command zone because you can put it out so early, and it begins to impact how your opponent plays as soon as it hits the board. And even when it's not on the board, if it's in your command zone, your opponent has to consider that if they have only one attacker or how to order their attackers, that they might not really do as much damage as they're expecting. And he's so good that, in my opinion, you should be using 1 in the command zone and 3 in the deck in almost any double Overseers or more deck. Okay, next on the list at number 6, I know you guys were expecting to hear about Dragon of Autumn Wind. Whoa, this card is really pushed. Like, I would be playing this card even if you wiped off the text underneath the Flying Unstoppable Haste. Being a 25/25 Flying Unstoppable Haste basically means that you're practically guaranteed to hit your opponent for a quarter of their maximum health before they even have a chance to interact with the card. And even then, if you don't have the card, if you can feasibly play it, your opponent has to be ready. They have to be ready to get pounded for 25 damage. Whether or not you have the card, they don't know that, so they have to play around it. Really big deal. And in addition to that, drawing 2 cards off the top of your opponent's deck is just icing on the cake. The card's so strong that it's really just changed the Warpath faction as a whole. And 11 resources is a very interesting number for Warpath, because Warpath can very, very easily make the transition from 10 to 11, unlike some other factions. Notably, Untapped Wilderness is going to drop it to 10 resources. So for a card that is already very good in Warpath, you can prepare yourself to be able to drop the dragon whenever you want if you get to that stage in the game. Very, very, very insanely powerful card that you see a lot of now. Okay, at number 5, we have Luca, Rebellion Leader. And although I haven't seen nearly as much of this card as I was expecting, it really, and like I said, we're looking for impact. It really impacts the way your opponent has to play the game when they're against a 2 Genesis deck, because at 6 resources, most notably, you have Mass Death, which would ordinarily, prior to Rebellion, guarantee the safety of a double Veror deck from an attack from a double Genesis deck. Because Genesis just didn't have that tool before. But with Luca, Rebellion Leader, Luca, because her effect is a deploy effect, happens before Mass Death, guaranteed. And that enables you to play straight through Mass Death, regardless of whether your opponent plays it. And that alone is very, very crazy. And that is something that you would not be able to do prior to Rebellion. You could not just say to yourself, I don't care if my opponent has Mass Death. That's a crazy statement. Like, if you, prior to Rebellion, said, oh, well, it's turn 6, so I don't have to care that my opponent has Mass Death, that's wow. Nuts. And I will also mention that Tome of the Dead, you can block your own cards from destroying your characters with Luca, which enables you to go from you and your opponent having a fairly equal board to a complete just change in the amount of power you have relative to your opponent. And it's just nuts. Okay, next up, we have a kind of a 2-for-1. The actual card is Placebotron for number 4. But I will also mention Gorgon Beam because they're very closely related, and that is because both of them basically let you get an artifact card out for a very minimal cost. Gorgon Beam because the artifact is just a perk and you actually get removal with it, and Placebotron because it's quite literally a free card. And these cards took the Omnitron deck, which prior to Rebellion was a fun deck, but far from the most competitive, to a deck that you have to be seriously prepared to play against. Like prior to Rebellion, Omnitron would take quite some time to get ready, but with the introduction of Gorgon Beam and Placebotron, you can really seriously get the Omnitron out and running as early as turn 7 without actually having that ridiculous of an opener, which is very, very, very crazy, which at a bare minimum changes the meta, changes the top deck, and also means that if you have the ability to put cards in your sideboard that are going to hit artifacts, it's pretty important to be ready for that at this point in time. Okay, number 3, we have Shunhel's Urn. And what's interesting about this card is I will, for those of you who have been playing for a very long time, we're going to talk about counting the days. And for those of you who haven't played for a very long time, when this card, Counting the Days, was released in Oppression, it was an extremely different card. I believe it was 5 resources, and it had a totally different effect. It used to be each turn you'd get 10% more complete, and at the end where you have 100%, you just straight up won the game. No exceptions. And that was really unfair, so they changed it. But Shunhao's Urn feels like a fixed version of that card. And what it really does is that it gives the Descendants of the Dragons faction a tool that they needed to do what they were already trying to do, which is stall until they slowly win. Prior to Rebellion, this had to be done through draining your opponent's morale, essentially. But the problem with that was that when you were playing against another control deck, very frequently they could just opt to not play characters or play very few characters, so they wouldn't ever have to worry about losing very much morale. So sometimes you just get stumped, and no matter how long you stalled, it just didn't really make a difference. But this card changes that. And in addition, it's worth noting that against aggressive decks, it's very important to be able to defend yourself and prioritize that. And Shunhao's Urn, although it's not a defensive card, if you manage to stabilize for just long enough to put it on the board, you can dedicate 100% of your resources to defending yourself, because Shunhao's Urn will naturally kill your opponent regardless of how you play. Artifact removal is not usually in the main deck, but Shunhao's Urn is another reason, in addition to the Placebotron Omnitron thing, is another reason players now need to care a lot more about whether they can kill artifacts or not. Super crazy card. I like it a lot. It opens some very interesting decks up, and I think it fills a weakness that Descendants of the Dragons, I think, desperately needed to be filled. Number 2, and this is a serious controversial card for a lot of players, Acquire. And let's begin by saying that it is Rift Run. It's impactful in Rift Run because it's a common, it's 1 purity, and it's just 4 for draw 3 is just really good right off the bat. So that alone makes it just good in Rift Run. But if we look at Constructed, because it's 1 purity, because 4 resources for draw 3 cards is already good, it's just playable. But in addition to that, drawing 3 cards because it's from your opponent's deck gives you the chance to get something disproportionately good for you. Like, for example, Shunhao's Urn. Like, you can deny your opponent a core win condition while simultaneously being able to put it out against them. So really, really, really crazy card there. But not only that, because it lets you steal your opponent's cards, you can drain their deck down to 0 cards, which means that any deck running Acquire has the ability to wait the game out and turn it into a control matchup where you drain them from all of their cards that they can play. And that, first of all, is really important for Triple Veror, because it means, like, for example, Triple Veror, I think prior, one of the better win conditions for Triple Veror was to use Demoralize or Oblivion. But Oblivion didn't do anything for the large portion of the game because you couldn't play it the large portion of the game. And Demoralize, even though you did the same kind of thing with it, which is you recycled it until your opponent died, it has no immediate positive impact on the game and costs 1 more resources. Where Acquire immediately gives you the advantage of having more cards in your hand. So it's just a better win condition than those other 2 cards, in my opinion, at this point. But you can actually use them in combination with each other because they work pretty well together in addition to that. The last thing I will say is that because it is 1 purity, you see it a lot outside of Triple Veror. And it gives some decks that are ordinarily not control decks the ability to fall back on a control game later on, which is pretty crazy. Like, for example, you can use Adaptive Ritualist and Recycles and Gather Sots to accomplish a state where you can drain your opponent out of cards without really dedicating yourself to a certain faction, because you've got Recycle and Gather Thoughts don't have purity. You can use them in any deck, and acquires 1 purity. So you can put 3 recycles and 3 gather thoughts and 3 acquires all into the same deck, and you immediately have a win condition package that doesn't really cost you much, because all those cards, gather thoughts and recycle, replace themselves, and acquire gives you card advantage. So that's really crazy. Definitely is a card you're going to see a lot in almost any Veror deck at this point. All right, and number 1, I think a lot of you are probably expecting this to be number 1, is Martyr of Life, which opened up a new deck entirely that is super, super strong and a lot of fun in my opinion. Wow, what a card. So in addition to it being super powerful and opening up a new deck type, it also really changed the importance of a lot of existing cards. Like Karini went from kind of the fringe weird card to very core card for Warpath, because the earlier you get out your Martyr of Life, the closer you are to getting to the stage where you can just start dumpstering your opponent. But in addition to making a lot of these ramp cards a lot more powerful, it also made a lot of cards that were just super high cost suddenly very important. I will mention Dragon of the Autumn Wind and Helix Worm, but those are from a Rebellion. But outside of those, you have cards like Titan of the New World and Kark and Hidden by Clouds, which admittedly you saw some of these before, but you saw them in a fairly small amount because you couldn't justify dedicating such a large portion of your deck to these insanely high cost cards. But when they cost 2, suddenly that's just, whoa, that's Titan the New World costs 25, pretty hard to play. When he costs 2, he looks pretty good to me. He seems pretty good, pretty playable. And the last card I will say that got changed, how impactful it was with the introduction of Martyr of Life, is Initial, who was not like bad before, but Initial now, when your opponent plays Initial after they have the Martyr of Life effect, you have to be prepared to get like completely bodied, because your opponent could drop multiple Helix Worms, they could drop multiple Titans of the New World, and you have to be ready for it. Whoa. Okay, so that is our whole top 10 list. If you agreed with me, let me know. If you think I missed any cards that should be on the list, or put cards on the list that you don't think belong there, or maybe you think I should change the ranking, let me know in the comments. And I am also going to say that I've decided to try to increase the interactions I get on YouTube to try to, grow the channel faster. I'm going to give away 1 booster pack every video. It's not much, but it'll hopefully get people a little more interested in the discussion. And the way you enter to win the booster pack is you just comment and put your Infinity Wars username in the comment. And if you, for whatever reason, are not remotely interested in the booster pack, just don't put your username in your comment. And you can say whatever you want. You can, if you want, you can just say hi, but I also encourage you to discuss the content in the video. And it's been fun, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, everybody, peace out.